Okay, so welcome back, guys. Today's conversation is going to be about the heart. And so today's lecture will really just be about figuring out the structure of the heart, our major blood flow pathways through the heart. We'll talk a little bit about the connective tissue that surrounds it, how it sits within the chest cavity, and then we'll talk about some of the major vessels that are entering and exiting the heart. And then we'll wrap up with a box plot diagram to kind of show how blood moves through the heart. Right. And so as always, feel free to stop me if you guys have questions, or if I'm going too fast or anything like that, just holler and let me know. All right. So the heart itself, in terms of functionality, is very straightforward. It's one of the most simple organs in our body because all it does is pump. It pumps blood throughout the body, right, in the form of blood vessels. It's how it navigates and connects different tissues to one another. That's its main job, is to circulate blood throughout our body. But secondarily, we've got some other cool functions that are wrapped up in this too. So with the pumping activity of the heart, not only are we circulating blood through our blood vessels, supplying oxygen to target tissues, taking away nitrogenous waste and gaseous waste back to the lungs, but we're able to also transport things like heat. We can regulate the thermal capacity of our body by shifting how blood flows through specific arteries and specific veins. So we can control a lot of that. Again, all of our molecular, hormonal, chemical signals that are passing through our body move through the blood supply system, and that's all facilitated in terms of pressure by the heart, right? So it's a pretty cool organ. One of the other unique things about it too is its ability to generate its own independent electrical impulses separate from the rest of the nervous system. So we've got this little cool set of nerve fibers called the sinoatrial node, aka the pacemaker, that's responsible for generating impulses that stimulate the heart to contract, right? So the pacemaker is interesting because, sometimes it fails or sometimes it starts to get out of whack and can cause really bad arrhythmias or irregular heartbeats. And if that's the case, then we can have corrective surgery to replace that. We can put in a electrical pacemaker that will help regulate the beating pattern of the heart too. So we can see the heart itself, that sits right here in the middle of the thoracic cavity, is connected to all of the blood vessels in the body through a set of 4 major vessels that we'll talk about later in our discussion today. So really, if you guys remember from our conversation before we went on spring break, there's essentially 3 major pathways in the circulatory system, in the blood circulatory system of the body, excluding the lymphatic circulatory system. So we've got our not sympathetic, our systemic circulatory system that's going to be sending oxygenated blood out to the rest of the body to deliver oxygen and important nutrients to target tissues. All of that exits the heart via what we call the dorsal aorta. I'll explain why that's the case later on. You guys can just refer to it as the aorta. That's probably how you'll see it on a test. And so we can then send blood up to our head, all the way down to our toes. You can send blood anywhere it needs to go, right? So once that blood enters the target tissues, it navigates its way through these things called capillary beds, which we'll discuss in our next chapter on blood vessels and blood flow. So once blood passes through here, we end up back in the veins, or the venous return that ends up going back to the heart up here, so that we can repeat the process. But before we go back through the systemic circuit, we've got to go out through our pulmonary circuit to drop off carbon dioxide and pick up oxygen, right? And then re-enter the heart on our left side. So we'll describe all of these like kind of cool little rules and things that the heart follows here in a minute. But you might have noticed I left out another circuit as well. So we've got the coronary circuit that's going to be supplying blood directly to the heart itself, right? So the heart, while it pumps blood to everywhere else in the body, it also needs blood to survive as well. The heart itself is made out of muscle, its own specialized kind of muscle, which is super, super cool. So we'll talk about that later too. But it really needs a lot of blood. by volume, the muscle cells of the heart are 25% mitochondria. So that means they require lots and lots of blood, lots and lots of oxygen, right? So the heart itself has its own circuit outside of the systemic, and we call it the coronary, but really it's a branch off of the systemic circuit. Okay, so there's some rules of the heart that I'll type in the chat here for you guys. So barring any kind of birth defect, all right, you'll notice that on this slide here, we've got kind of two different color schemes going on. We've got red and blue, right? So typically in the literature, and what you guys will see in your textbook is pretty much everything that is red is going to be considered oxygen rich, and blue is going to be considered oxygen poor, right? So red is oxygen rich, and blue is oxygen poor. So red is oxygen rich, blue is oxygen poor. Now, some of you guys may have heard of the adage that all arteries carry oxygen rich blood and all veins carry oxygen poor blood. And that's true, except for that it's not actually, right? There's one instance where we have arteries that are going to be carrying oxygen poor blood, and then one instance where we're going to have veins carrying oxygen rich blood. So instead of thinking, of arteries as being oxygen rich and veins being oxygen poor, a better way to remember those vessels is that arteries always take blood away from the heart. Right? So A for away, arteries always take blood away from the heart, and then veins always take blood towards the heart. Okay. So that will always be true. Arteries always take blood away from the heart. Veins always take blood towards the heart. And in general, like I said, kind of barring any sort of birth defect, the right side of the heart carries oxygen poor blood. So this is also typically part of the systemic, what we'll call the systemic return, and pulmonary out. Okay, so the right side of the heart. And again, when we think of right and left sides here, we're going to be referring to it anatomically. So patient relative, like if you're looking at the screen right here, the blue side is the right side. Okay, so right side of the heart tends to be oxygen poor blood. It's part of the systemic return part of that circuit, and then the pulmonary output of the pulmonary circuit. And then the left side of the heart tends to carry oxygen rich blood and is going to be considered part of the systemic. Let's think about it this way. Let's think of it as part of the pulmonary return and systemic outflow or output. That's kind of the beginning of the systemic circuit, right? So that actually works better with the other one because then it follows the pathway of blood nicely, right? So these are just some general rules of thumb when thinking about blood flow in the heart, identifying parts of the heart that are going to be carrying oxygen rich or oxygen poor blood. If you're in a particular chamber where, if you're a blood cell and you're in a particular chamber of the heart, where did you just come from? Where are you going? That sort of thing, right? And then one of the last things about blood flow in the heart is anytime blood moves from or leaves a chamber, I will say leaves a chamber, it will pass through a valve. Okay. Anytime blood leaves a chamber in the heart, it's going to pass through a valve. We've got 4 major valves in the heart, 2 different classes of valves. But anytime blood leaves a chamber, it's going to pass through a valve. All right. So we'll put all of these rules of thumb here into effect in a little bit when we start talking about the box plot for the heart and think about mapping how blood moves through our body. All right. You guys can give me a thumbs up if you're good to go, or let me know if you have questions before we move on. Awesome. Thank you. Also, strategically, I need a drink right here. What are we drinking today? We're drinking Groundwork Certified Organic Cold Brew Coffee, Nitro Edition. I'm not usually one for nitro cold brews, but this one just caught my eye. It's pretty good. It's another Sprouts pickup if you guys are interested. Okay, let's move on here. All right. So with the way that the heart sits in the chest cavity, one of the cool things about our thoracic cavity is there's kind of 4 different cavities built into it. So each of the lungs, remember, gets its own little sac. We call it the pleural sacs. So just like in the abdomen, which we'll get to in a little bit, but if you guys recall from way back in chapter 1 when we looked at sort of the different cavities of the body, and how the abdomen is kind of divided up into the abdominopelvic region, where you have the abdominal cavity and then the pelvic cavity, which are kind of linked together. The thoracic cavity contains these pleural peritoneum connective tissues that will isolate different organs in the chest cavity. So for example, each of the lungs is isolated in its own little environment. We call it a pleural sac. And we have parietal and visceral pleura. It's the same material that is used to generate the parietal and visceral peritoneum. So again, if you guys recall from chapter 1, we had talked a little bit about connective tissue that coats our organs, and we call that peritoneum. In the abdomen, that's what it's called, is peritoneum. You have parietal peritoneum, which sits on the outside, kind of up against the body wall, and then visceral, which sits right up against the tissue itself. If you want to think about it compared to something else more recently that we've seen, think about it from the perspective of each of the meninges of the brain. So there are 3 different meninges of the brain, but remember the outermost one called the dura mater, that would be equivalent to something like the parietal peritoneum. And then the pia mater, which grafts right up against the brain, that would be equivalent to something like the visceral peritoneum, right? So in our chest cavity here, we've got our lungs that have the parietal pleura in blue, which sits right up against the body wall. And then each of the lungs themselves is coated in their own connective tissue called visceral pleura. All right. So I bring that up because the heart gets its own cavity as well, called the pericardial sac. All right. And we have pericardium, which makes up that sac. And just like we have parietal and visceral pleura for each of our lungs, we have parietal and visceral pericardium. It's the same idea. Okay. So the heart gets its own sac called the pericardial sac. But then we have this weird cavity by proxy that kind of pops up, because what's not depicted here, but is true in real life, is each of these pleura and pericardia are grafted up against the body wall anteriorly, right? So all of the greater vessels that we're seeing here, so like the trachea, the esophagus, the jugular veins, the carotid arteries, the subclavian veins, brachiocephalic veins, all of these greater vessels that are entering the heart and exiting the heart are in space as well, right? So each of these vessels are in a cavity, kind of a cavity by proxy, called the mediastinum, right? So that's what that is, the mediastinum. Some people say mediastinum. Again, potato, potato. Mediastinum is probably the better way to pronounce it. I've always called it the mediastinum. But yeah, just as long as you know what it is for a test, right? So mediastinum, mediastinum, whatever. But this cavity by proxy comes about because of the existence of the parietal and visceral pleura and the parietal and visceral pericardium. Okay. Also, notice how the heart has some asymmetry itself. It doesn't just sit front and center in the middle of our chest cavity. So when we do kind of Pledge of Allegiance, I don't know how long it's been since you guys have done the Pledge of Allegiance. It's been a long time for me. As a high school teacher, we usually do it every day, but it's still been a little while. So the heart itself, when we place our right hand over our heart, we've got this bit of asymmetry here. So the heart isn't just sitting right across the middle of our chest. It actually does lean more leftward on our patient. So in anatomical position here, it's more left justified, right? So much so that it actually impinges upon the shape and structure of the left lung in the chest cavity. So each of the lungs of our chest cavity have lobes associated with them. The right one has 3 different lobes. It's got a superior, middle, and inferior lobe of the lung. But the left only has 2 lobes, presumably because the shape of the heart here is pushing the shape and structure of the lung itself over here too. So it's kind of infringing upon the space that's allocated for that lung normally, right? But I don't know about you guys. I'm pretty happy that it does, because without this giant organ here, we wouldn't be what we are today, right? And as a good rule of thumb, kind of a guesstimation of the size of your heart is generally about the size of your, closed fist. Like, it's not like a clenched one, but just like a closed, fingers open, palm size, or, palm closed fist right there. That's the average size. It can be a little bit bigger or a little bit smaller depending on the person. It'll depend on a lot of things like your exercise activity. If you're a smoker, if you have any sort of respiratory infection or disease, anything that'll force the heart to work harder will enlarge it. All right. And chronic enlargement and uncontrolled enlargement, something called cardiomegaly, can actually affect the function of the lungs, and you can die from conditions like that. Right. Or if you're like me and you have a massive growth spurt between, 7th and 8th grade in middle school, you grow 6 inches in a summer, your heart is actually too small for your body, and you end up getting a really, really rare form of seizures that occur because, your heart is working itself to try and catch up to how large your body has grown in such a short amount of time. And you end up kind of blacking out and having like really bad head rush symptoms. So that's what happened to me when I was in middle school. I grew 6 inches in the span of 3 months. It was incredibly painful. Being tall can be overrated sometimes. But getting there, yeah, it was really, really painful. I had really bad shin splints. But yeah, I actually had I'd gone to the doctor, I got EKGs, I had gotten EEGs and all this stuff done. And one of the things that they figured out was that my heart was actually just too small for my body. So it eventually, I grew into it, and then the seizures and everything went away. And I should clarify too, they weren't epileptic seizures. What would happen is, just like I said, since my heart was so small, I shouldn't say so small, it was just not big enough for my body size. It hadn't caught up to, the scaling coefficient for my body size. So it was overworking itself, and I developed a pretty pronounced arrhythmia as a result. And so I would get these like really weird spasms in my heartbeat where it would actually stop beating for periods of time. Not like super long periods of time, but like a couple seconds, enough to where I would like pass out. So it was pretty interesting for a little while. I say interesting now. It was honestly kind of scary in the moment, because we didn't know what it was. But then once I got into high school, it eventually caught up, and then things worked out. But yeah, it was pretty nuts. So size of the heart matters, definitely. Insert Grinch stole Christmas meme, if you will. All right. Moving right along here. Here's another picture of how the heart sits within the pericardium. So there's actually some space between the visceral pericardium and the parietal pericardium too. So that's important. That space contains pericardial fluid, kind of like a paralymph that we would find inside of our inner ear cavities, kind of for responding to sound waves. The heart doesn't respond to sound waves, but the viscosity is similar to the paralymph in our ear. So that fluid that kind of surrounds the heart helps with the elastic recoil of the heart each time that it depolarizes or contracts and forces blood out through the systemic or pulmonary circuits. Now, if the fluid builds up too much inside this little kind of pericardial cavity right here, then that can actually affect how well the heart can recoil in between each of its strokes. And so that is obviously bad, because if the ventricles, these two lower chambers, and what we're seeing most of right here, so we've got what's called our right ventricle and then a little bit of our left ventricle back here, those chambers are responsible for forcing blood out to the body. And when they contract, they shrink and they twist on each other. But then as they relax and recoil and they expand, if you've got a lot of fluid out here that's affecting that, then they can't fill up with blood effectively. And so that messes up cardiac output and has a whole host of other health issues that go along with it. All right. So here we've got a good representation of the heart that's been removed from the chest cavity. So in anatomical position, we're actually seeing mostly the right side of the heart. So a good way to kind of think about how the heart sits within your chest cavities, you can take either your right or your left hand and put your thumb up against your chest. So if you do your left hand, if you're doing your left hand, your palm side is going to be your left side of the heart, and then the knuckles are going to be the right side, and it's the opposite for the right hand. I like to use the right hand. So if you have your right hand up against your sternum right here, put your thumb, the palm side would be the left side of the heart, and the knuckles would be the right side. And so if you make your fist and then you set it across your chest just like that, that mirrors very much, the sides of what you'll see of the heart in anatomical position. So you see mostly right sides of the heart. So we've got our main venous return chamber, what's called the right atrium. So we can see most of that in anatomical position, and we can also see most of our right ventricle here. So we've got some pictures that we'll look at in a second where we can actually see inside of these and see what they look like. And then up here, kind of tucked and hidden away, because again, it's mostly visible from the posterior view, is the left atrium. And then we've got a little bit of our left ventricle back here. What's kind of cool too is we'll look at some of the asymmetries in the ventricles here in just a minute. But our two chambers of the heart that receive blood from each of the pulmonary and systemic circuits are going to be the atria, right? So they sit above the ventricles. They're responsible for returning blood from either the systemic circuit or the pulmonary circuit. The right atrium receives blood from the systemic circuit, right? And I should say the coronary circuit as well. A vessel called the coronary sinus dumps directly into the right atrium. But all of our blood from the rest of our body, besides the coronary circuit, is going to return to the heart either via the superior vena cava or the inferior vena cava. So those are the two big blood vessels that are going to be returning blood back to the heart, right? And then we've got our dorsal aorta, which is going to be responsible for sending blood out through the systemic circuit, right? So this big, large vessel here in red, and we've got some other greater vessels out here: brachiocephalic artery, right common carotid, right subclavian, and then we've got our left common carotid and the left subclavian arteries over here. Okay, and then I didn't mention this one down here, but this is going to be the pulmonary trunk. This is one of those examples where I mentioned, or it's the only example where we have an artery that's going to be carrying oxygen poor blood, but still away from the heart. So the pulmonary trunk represents the pulmonary arteries that are sending blood towards the lungs, right? And so we've got our little pulmonary arteries coming out here. So a quick aside on like nomenclature and terminology that I'm using here, which you might hear me use as a reference to venous return or venous tributaries, and then arterial branches or arterial outflow. So let me put those in the chat here. So veins kind of act as rivers. So they will return blood to the heart, starting out initially in smaller vessels until ultimately they get into bigger and larger vessels as they get closer to the heart. So I might use a word like a tributary to describe a venous vessel that's going to be contributing blood to a larger vessel. So for example, it's not labeled, but this guy right here where my mouse cursor is, this is going to be one of our jugular veins. This is the common jugular vein. So we've got an external and an internal. So we've got a common jugular vein. And then we have over here, which would be coming from our right arm, this would be the right subclavian vein. So both of these vessels are tributaries because they end up forcing blood into this little tiny branch right here. It depends, and this can be somewhat variable on people. Sometimes it's not even there, but this would be the right brachiocephalic vein. Okay, it's a lot more pronounced on the left side, but so our common jugular, left common jugular, left subclavian vein, contributing or acting as tributaries to the left brachiocephalic vein right there. Okay, and notice too, so brachiocephalic, brachio referring to arm, cephalic referring to head. The names in themselves tell you where they're coming from, right? And so that's another important thing too to recognize, and this will just take practice, but recognizing the direction of blood flow in a vessel, recognizing and remembering that veins are always carrying blood towards the heart, arteries are always carrying blood away. So if you're in the brachiocephalic vein, you should know, okay, my next major stop is going to be the right atrium, but my next immediate vessel that I'm going to contribute to is the superior vena cava, right? So those are things to work towards in your studying efforts as you guys are perusing through some of the arteries and veins this week. So don't forget to start on those things this week. So the superior vena cava here pretty much drains everything above the diaphragm. So your chest cavity, your arms, your head, everything above the diaphragm, the lungs themselves, actually not the lungs themselves get drained via the pulmonary veins that come back here into into the left atrium. But anyway, everything else in the chest cavity or everything above the diaphragm drains back into the superior vena cava ultimately. So all those little tiny vessels act as tributaries into the larger return vessel back to the right atrium. Okay. So whether you're a blood cell coming from above the atrium or below the atrium, everything below the diaphragm comes back via the inferior vena cava. So all of our stuff from the abdominal cavity and below comes back through the inferior vena cava. Once you get to the right atrium, next stop is the right ventricle, and then you're out through your pulmonary trunk, right? So we'll look at some blood flow patterns here in a bit more detail in a sec, but kind of start thinking about how you could trace the flow of blood. So the last thing I wanted to mention before we move on here is that arteries act like trees and branch away from each other, or branch outward and away. So I'll usually use a word like a branch or branching to refer to arteries, okay? So they act like trees in that a vessel like the aorta here is kind of like the trunk of the tree, because blood initially is leaving from the left ventricle here and comes out through the aorta and then goes off into a bunch of smaller vessels as we get closer and closer towards our target structures or our target tissues. This will make more sense as you guys read through chapter 13 and look at some of the structures of arteries and veins and really kind of start to get a handle on, kind of like I just said, the structural differences between arteries and veins. That'll help kind of set those apart. Arteries tend to be much thicker and more robust than veins do. Okay. Let's see. Did Jamie get booted? Yep. Okay. Hey, Jamie. Welcome back. Did you get booted? That's cool. Jamie? You there? Hello? Okay. Well, maybe until you get your mic issues sorted, or if you just want to message me in the chat, there seems to be something going on with your microphone. But yeah, either way, I'm glad you're back. Okay, so before we move on, veins act as rivers. They contribute towards one another. They act as tributaries. And then arteries act like trees. They branch away from one another. All right. Everybody good with that? Give me a thumbs up if you guys are good to go. Cool. Thanks, guys. Thank you. Thank you. All right. So now here we've got a real heart that's been removed from the chest cavity. The pericardial sac has been reflected so we can see more of it. And we've got some really nice dissection done on some of the major coronary vessels that are going to be supplying blood to the heart. So we've got our right coronary artery and our left coronary artery coming out here, transforming into the left anterior descending artery or the anterior interventricular artery. So we're going to come back to this guy right here in a little bit. It's a really important coronary artery that's responsible for some of the most lethal heart attacks that affect the United States. So still, even as according to the CDC data for 2020, even with everything that we've experienced as a country and as a planet over the past year, heart disease is still the #1 killer of individuals, at least in our country. It's still that bad, right? So we'll talk a little bit about heart disease, heart attacks, and this guy right here, the anterior interventricular artery, is going to be a major culprit for some of those more lethal ones. Okay, so what we can see, we've got our large right ventricle here, the right atrium, we've got a little bit of the superior vena cava peeking out right there. Pericardium's been reflected in our bit of our pulmonary trunk too, and then the super large dorsal aorta. All right. Okay. And then finally, before we take a look inside the heart, we can look at kind of our posterior view or the dorsal view of the heart. So we've got mostly, like I said, the left side that we can observe here. So we've got our left atrium right here, again, colored red because it's oxygen rich. We have our pulmonary veins, which are the only exception for veins that are going to be returning blood back to the heart. Let's see. Oh, sorry, Jamie. I'm just looking at your message. Okay, no worries. Glad you're back. So we've got our pulmonary veins returning oxygen-rich blood back to the heart, getting ready to send that out into the systemic circuit. And then we've got our very, very large left ventricle down here. But we can also see some of the coronary the coronary veins that are going to be, returning blood back to the right atrium to then go out to the pulmonary circuit. So as I mentioned before, though, the the cardiac sinus right here is going to be delivering blood right into the right atrium. It actually bypasses the inferior vena cava altogether. All right. So let's look at a coronal section through the heart and kind of see what that looks like here. All right. So with our coronary cross section right here, what we can see now is we've got a really good view into the insides of our chambers of our heart, right? So let's take the perspective of a red blood cell that's going to be entering the heart and kind of follow it on its pathway, its trajectory through the heart here, right? So, either coming from the superior inferior vena cava, we enter our right atrium, okay? So the next chamber that we get to would be the right ventricle. But remember, anytime we leave a chamber, we have to pass through a valve. So on the right side of the heart right here, separating the atrium from the right ventricle is our first valve that we pass through. That valve is what we call the tricuspid valve. I always remember it because you always try to be right, and the tricuspid is on the right side of the heart. It's also named this because it has 3 different leaflets, so 3 different parts to it. Tri referring to 3. So tricuspid valve, try to be right. So we pass from the right atrium to the right ventricle via the tricuspid valve. And then from the right ventricle, this is going to be where we're sending blood out through the pulmonary circuit. So again, leaving a chamber, we're going to pass through yet another valve. This is our next class of valve that we call semilunar valves. So we've got 2 different kinds of valves. The tricuspid belongs to a class called the atrioventricular valves, which looks like a scary word, but it's not, because it's literally just telling you which 2 chambers it's separating, right? So the atria and the ventricles. So valve right here, tricuspid valve, atrioventricular valve. Each of the valves that are protecting the arteries from the ventricles, or separating, I shouldn't say protecting, it's separating the arteries from the ventricles, are going to be what we call semilunar valves. Okay, so semilunar valves. So the pulmonary valve right here separates the right ventricle from the pulmonary trunk, right? Which is just really, you can call it the pulmonary artery. It's the same thing because then it just branches out into right and left pulmonary arteries, or right over here where my cursor is, and then left pulmonary arteries. Okay. So once blood goes out to the lungs, it picks up oxygen, and then it's going to return to the left ventricle via the left and right pulmonary veins. Okay, so Tony, I see you in the meeting still, but there's somebody else in the waiting room named the same thing as you, but they're going to stay there until you can confirm or something like that, or until I feel like that's not you. But anyway, so blood returns to the heart from the pulmonary circuit via the left atrium, just here. And then we go down into the left ventricle. Now, again, we're passing from one chamber to another, so we got to pass through another valve. This one's called the bicuspid valve, sometimes called the mitral valve, right? You guys may have heard of it, referred to as the mitral, but most people nowadays will call it the bicuspid. That's just fairly commonplace. Mitral is very old school. But if any of you guys are familiar with heart murmurs or like leaky valves or anything like that that can cause arrhythmias, then usually it's this valve that ends up causing the issue, right? So the bicuspid tends to be the one that ends up being leaky as you get older, or if you develop a heart murmur, an arrhythmia, or something like that, the bicuspid valve is usually the culprit. And what happens is little flaps or parts of these structures called chordae tendineae will fail. And then as the ventricle contracts and applies tension to the chordae tendineae here, then the valve won't be able to retain a perfect seal and separate the atrium from the ventricle. So we'll talk about this more on Thursday, but maintaining separation and in terms of pressure between the atrium and the ventricles is super important for maintaining proper arterial pressure and blood pressure throughout our body, right? So if this valve starts to fail and starts to flutter and we allow for a little bit of backflow into the left atrium, then that can cause problems and encourage things like clots or embolisms or thromboses to form. And then if those form, then that's really not good. Okay. So left ventricle, once we're down here via the bicuspid valve, we're then going to be sent out via the dorsal aorta. And we pass through our last semilunar valve, just called the aortic valve, right? So we call this the dorsal aorta, and there's different parts to it. We can call this part the ascending aorta, the aortic arch, and then the descending aorta. I refer to it as the dorsal aorta because comparatively, it's the same structure that we have in quadrupeds, other animals that walk around on four legs, which we're closely related to. And we call it the dorsal aorta because this vessel ends up arching around and following our spine right next to our dorsum. So oftentimes it gets called the dorsal aorta. So if I say dorsal aorta, I'm just referring to this entire vessel right here and all of the, not all the branches that are coming off of it, but that's the main vessel that I'm referring to is just the aorta, right? Okay, so let's take a break from this for a sec. And then what we're going to do is use a whiteboard here, and we're going to draw out just a quick little box plot to kind of explain this in a little bit more simple geometric terms, but recognizing that the flow of blood in the box plot is not technically anatomically correct. I'll show you what I mean in a sec. So Tony, is your computer right now or your phone having an issue or something? Okay, if you try again, I'll let you in. I didn't know if it was somebody posing as you. Let me pull up a whiteboard here. There we go. All right, is that better, Tony? Hopefully. Okay. All right, cool. Thanks for letting me know. All right, so let's draw our little box plot here. Actually, first, let's get a sense of what the heck we're writing. Okay, so this is a box plot for blood flow. Box here. We've got our 4 different chambers. Don't judge me. I know this. Actually, I think that one's straight. Okay. If it's not, don't judge me. Ugh. There we go. Okay, cool. I don't think that one's straight. That one doesn't look straight to me. That one's kind of weird. Anyway, all right. I'm going to do some abbreviations here. So we've got our right atrium and our right ventricle. So RA, right atrium, RV, right ventricle. And then we've got our left atrium, LA, and then left ventricle, LV. Okay, so those are our 4 chambers. Right atrium, right ventricle, left atrium, left ventricle. Right, so just remember we're always in anatomical position here. And just some, how do I say this? I don't know, just some like a key or like a legend here, remembering that things that are red tend to be oxygen rich. And then blue are oxygen poor. Red is oxygen rich, blue is oxygen poor. All right. So remember our 2 contributing vessels that are going to lead into the right atrium are going to be the inferior vena cava and the superior vena cava. Right? So we've got superior vena cava, SVC, and then inferior vena cava, IVC. IVC. Yeah, there we go. Okay. So each of those vessels are going to be returning oxygen poor blood to the heart. Let's see. Yeah. So oxygen poor blood coming back to the heart from whatever part of the body it's coming from, and then enters the right atrium. Okay. So then we've got our valve. Oops, I don't like that. We're going to make it black. So we got our valve that separates the right atrium from the right ventricle. We call that valve the tricuspid valve. Tricuspid valve, right? So our blood is still moving through here. All right, now we're in the right ventricle. So then we're going to exit the right ventricle via our pulmonary artery. Let's keep consistent. Pulmonary artery. But again, before that happens, remember we've got our valve That closes that off and protects it. So we've got our pulmonary valve. Closes that off. All right. Some blood goes out and picks up oxygen. Goes out to the lungs and then comes back via the left, or to the left atrium via the pulmonary veins. Okay, pulmonary veins. Yeah, I spelled that right. All right, so we've got our blood returning, coming back here, back through our pulmonary veins. Cool. So now we're in the left atrium. And then we're going to go from the left atrium down to the left ventricle. But once again, we've got to get there via a valve, or we've got to pass through a valve. It's going to pass through the bicuspid. All right, so bicuspid valve. So once we're in here, cool, we're in the left ventricle, but then we're going to exit here via the pulmonary, I'm sorry, not the pulmonary, but just the dorsal aorta. Once again, passing through another valve, the aortic valve. Okay. I usually do something cool like this in class where this is usually like red and blue. Because remember, the first bit of the of blood going to the lungs is deoxygenated, but then as it comes back, it becomes oxygen rich. Right? There we go. All right. So this box plot is a really great way to geometrically kind of understand the flow of blood through the heart, right? But recognizing that this is not anatomically correct is important, even though it's a minor thing, because remember the aorta so the pulmonary artery and the aorta do not exit from the bottom of the heart, right? So they don't come out of the apex, they only come out of the base or the top of the heart. So really, if this were to be anatomically correct, these vessels should be exiting from the top here, but that would look kind of weird with this. So just remember that in terms of actual blood flow through the heart, these vessels sit at the top. So this is a geometrically correct diagram, but not anatomically correct. All right. So how are we doing? Thumbs up if we're still good so far. Awesome. Thanks, guys. Okay. Let's see. Yeah, we're almost done with our material for today. All right. So getting back here, One thing that I recommend you guys do to kind of practice and familiarize yourselves with the flow of blood through the heart, you won't have to draw it out on a test or anything, but conceptually it'll help you with understanding, like if you get a question, something like, if you're a red blood cell in the right atrium, where did you just come from? What vessel did you just come from? If you're, or I guess a better one to say would be, if you're a red blood cell that's just come from the neck, right? And you're in the right atrium now, what vessel did you just pass through, right? Then that would be the superior vena cava, because that's the next most recent vessel here, right? Or if you're in the left ventricle, which valve did you just pass through? That'd be the bicuspid valve, right? So kind of creating what I kind of think of as like blood flow maps is a really great way to test yourself on your understanding of how blood flows through the heart and kind of the main direction that it takes, right? All right, so now let's get into some of the kind of cool asymmetries of the heart here. And if we do a cross section through an actual heart, this one looks like it's been freshly dissected. So usually in a laboratory setting, if you guys get a chance to hold an actual heart, they're usually discolored, and a lot of that has to do with the embalming fluid that's used. But in reality, hearts are very red and very kind of like tough and tough and supple in a weird way. So what we can see here with our cross section through the heart is some of the internal structures, like our chordae tendineae that are down here, the trabeculae carnae, which is kind of the material of the endocardium, or the inner wall of the heart muscle here. But then we've got the chordae tendineae and then the papillary muscle that they're linked to connect to the valves right here. So these chordae tendineae are important because as the ventricles contract and force blood out into the body, the tension in the chordae tendineae develops, and it closes off the valves to help prevent backflow of blood in the heart. So the structure of the valves is pretty cool, and the structure of the heart is pretty neat. We'll look at here, but one thing to recognize too is there's some inherent asymmetry in the size of the chambers here. So the right ventricle, if you look at the wall of the ventricle here compared to the wall of the ventricle here, the wall of the right ventricle is pretty puny compared to the beefy wall of the left ventricle, right? So a lot of that asymmetry, again, it's our classic form-function relationship of of structures that we see in the body and then what they do in real life. Our left ventricle is so much bigger because it's forcing blood to farther structures or farther locations than the right ventricle is. The right ventricle is only pumping blood to the lungs, and the lungs are touching the heart. That's how close they are. So the left ventricle has got to get blood all the way up into your brain and all the way down to the tips of your toes. It's got to go a really long distance. So we need a lot more muscle mass associated with this chamber. It's tough to tell too, but the left ventricle is also bigger. It's got more volume than the right ventricle. Not like a ton, a crazy amount, but it's got a significantly larger volume inside of it. And then we've got a cool little section here where we've had the atria removed. This is a really neat dissection of whoever did this, but we can see we've got our two greater vessels that are exiting the heart. So we've got our pulmonary trunk. You can see the semilunar valve right here of the pulmonary valve. And then we've got our dorsal aorta right here, and you can see the flaps of the aortic semilunar valve just there. And then it's kind of tough to see, but we can see the leaflets of each of the bicuspid and then the tricuspid valves over here too. So we got 1, 2, 3 tricuspid, 1, 2 bicuspid leaflets right here. And it looks like the semilunar valves have 3 leaflets to them as well. They don't, it's just the folds inside of the actual cusps of the leaflets there. Right. So the semilunar valves only have 2 leaflets to them. All right. So here's what I was mentioning before about how when the ventricles contract, so as the atria are depolarizing, so we'll go over this in more detail on Thursday when we look at the cardiac cycle and we look at EKGs and how to interpret what the heart is doing electrically. when the atria are forcing blood into the ventricles to kind of get ready to send blood out to the body, the chordae tendineae here are relaxed and there's not a lot of tension in them. Same thing with the papillary muscle and the rest of the myocardium right here and the trabeculae carnae. Everything gets relaxed so the valves can open up and allow for blood to circulate in here. All right. Since there is low positive pressure, there's actually negative pressure building up in the left ventricle here. The semilunar valve remains closed. It's the same idea for the right ventricle too. But when the right ventricle contracts, we end up kind of seemingly counterintuitively developing tension within the tendons here of the chordae tendineae that force, in this case, since it's the left ventricle, that'll force the bicuspid valve closed and then create enough pressure to force open the aortic semilunar valve, right? So the second sound that you hear, like in a heartbeat, the lub dub, lub dub, lub dub, lub dub, that second sound, the dub part, is actually this valve closing, right? So it's post cardiac output, right? So in ventricle depolarization, everything develops tension, it gets taut, and then during ventricular repolarization, everything gets relaxed, all right? One of the neat things, I know I've said this a bunch today, there's a bunch of neat things about the heart, but yet another cool design intrigue here with the structure of the muscle fascicles of cardiac muscle is how they're arranged. So if you guys remember, the fascicle orientation in skeletal muscle is important because it helps you determine what that muscle does. The rod, straight, like parallel muscle fibers of our rectus abdominis tell us that as that muscle is attached on our xiphoid process and our pubic symphysis, when that muscle contracts, it's going to cause flexion of the spine. We know that with the multipennate structure of something like our deltoid, that's going to allow for complex abduction movement when that muscle is contracted, right? So if you raise your elbows, those are your deltoids activating and doing that abduction movement, right? Same thing with something like, or not really same thing, but, you know, comparing multipennate with bipennate muscle fibers of like your calf muscles. The structure and orientation of those fibers as they pull along a central tendon, like the Achilles tendon, and some other ones that are thrown in there, that can allow us to generate force in a really kind of interesting biomechanical way. Same thing goes for cardiac muscle fibers. They're oriented in a spiralized configuration. So when the heart contracts, when the ventricles and the atria contract, they produce a ringing motion. It's very similar to like if you wring out like a washcloth or a dish towel or something like that. We wring it out to extract as much moisture as possible. Same thing goes for the heart. The heart will wring itself out to force as much blood as it can into, you know, whichever circuit it's supplying blood to, either the coronary, cardiac, coronary, systemic, or pulmonary, right? And then here we've got a nice little diagram showcasing what we just talked about, the flow of blood as it passes from one chamber into the next. So this is a really great image to just kind of reinforce or check yourself if you're going along and you know, practicing drawing the box plot, you know, mapping out your blood flow. This is a really great way to kind of check yourself and make sure that you've got, you know, everything going the right way. And then again, another way to check yourself is this big flow diagram. So if you don't like using something like the box plot, this flow chart as well is a great way to visualize each of the systemic and pulmonary and coronary circuits and how they, you know, sit relative to one another. So, you know, passing through each of these specific structures, again, is a really good way to test your knowledge of blood flow through the heart. Okay. So one of our final things here that we'll discuss before we get into lab today, and if you guys don't mind, I'd actually like to just go right into lab because we're going to finish up here in the next couple slides, and then we'll just dive right into lab. I'll give you guys a lab activity, and then we'll all be good to go for the evening. So, you know, unless anybody's opposed to that, if you are, speak now or forever hold your peace, and then we can just get cracking on that. Everybody good with just kind of finishing up here in the next couple minutes and then just diving right into lab? Give me a thumbs up if you guys are. Okay, Dane, Kevin, awesome. Because the lab spiel will not take long. I promise you. All right. Tony's good with that. All right. So the few of you that have spoken, we're going to go with your votes. All right. So the major vessels that are supplying blood to the heart involve what we call the coronary arteries. So any of you guys that are familiar with heart disease or heard of heart disease before, coronary bypass, oh, he's having a coronary, right? These are the vessels that we're referring to. So we've got two major ones, our left and right ones. And each of these little branches all get their own name too, obviously. But some of the more prominent examples of this are what we call the interventricular arteries. So we've got the anterior interventricular artery, the right marginal artery, which kind of follows along the right border of the right ventricle. Okay. And then we've got our left marginal artery back here, circumflex arteries passing around the back side of the heart, supplying blood to all of the muscle tissue that makes up the myocardium. And so just like, arteries supplying blood, we've got veins that are draining blood. Okay, so we've got our cardiac veins that are going to be returning blood back to the coronary sinus here, which delivers blood directly into the right atrium. So again, fairly straightforward. All of this blood is going to be returning to the right atrium from the coronary circuit. So the problem with these vessels, though, is that since they are the first branch off of our dorsal aorta, if we end up developing a clot, so like a thrombosis or plaque buildup that gets into our arteries, or extra lipids that are maybe floating around, and if we have high cholesterol or blockages that are circulating in our systemic circuit, one of the most common places for those things to manifest is in the coronary arteries. These silly things are so prone to blockages, mainly because they are the first branches off of the systemic circuit. So the blood goes right here, first thing. So what ends up happening, right, with something like a heart attack, and a contributing factor to heart attack being heart disease, is some obstruction will end up affecting those coronary arteries that I just mentioned. So usually it's something like a thrombus, which is just a generic term for a clot, but it can also be plaque buildup. It depends on the person. Usually if it's heart disease, it's usually a blood clot that is formed either in the ventricle due to some sort of like a leaky valve, or if you have hypertension that develops too, that can also be a contributing factor. But the thrombus, or the clot, as it passes into the coronary vessel or the coronary artery, will block it. It'll obstruct the flow of blood to the heart. And again, because we are mammals and because we need constant blood flow to our tissues on a regular basis, and if we don't, then our tissues start to senesce. They undergo what's called an infarction, or lack of blood flow or a lack of oxygen supply to that particular tissue. If that thrombus ends up finding its way into one of those coronary arteries and causes a blockage, we end up undergoing what's called a myocardial infarction, which is fancy speak for the heart tissue. The myocardial tissue is not getting enough blood supply, so it's starting to seize and senesce, and it's starting to atrophy because of this. Now, heart attacks can take on a bunch of different shapes and sizes. Some of them are abrupt and very, 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 very potent and lethal. Sometimes they can happen over the course of days if you have a small, minor obstruction that's slowly closing off blood supply to the heart. It's actually what happened to my uncle last year. He ended up going to the hospital, presenting with chest pain, and he thought it was just like, some sort of like a muscle spasm or something like that. But then the doctors did an EKG on him and told him that, oh, you're having a heart attack. You are not leaving here, right? So if we're lucky enough to catch a heart attack in a situation like that, what do we do? How do we treat that? Or if somebody is in, various stages of hypertension, stage 1 or stage 2, how do we treat things like that? So hypertension, again, is just what ends up happening when the heart is overworking itself and it's generating too much blood pressure. So what we call our systolic blood pressure, the active pressure the ventricles are exerting on the arterial walls. If that gets too high, then we can be at risk for arterial rupture, or something like a heart attack as well. There's a couple different ways to treat it. Clinically, one of the most effective ways to treat something like a thrombosis is to administer something called tissue plasminogen activator. Uh-oh, it says my internet connection is unstable. Okay, I'll try and get through this before my internet craps out. But TPAs essentially break up clots. And so if you guys recall from last chapter, plasminogen activator helps break down clots, right? So it helps convert fibrin and instigates the fibrinolysis process. TPAs help instigate that. And if the blockage is clot-based, then TPAs are really, really effective, all right? Sometimes if the blockage is, if it's not clot-based, then surgery needs to be done to undergo what's called a coronary bypass. There's some more aggressive tactics that can be utilized in order to kind of treat a blockage that's plaque related by using something called a stent, which is essentially a little metal cage that's introduced into the center of the artery and then inflated to push the plaque rather into the arterial walls and open up blood flow to the heart. So stents can be administered. Usually if there's a bypass surgery that's done, we'll take vessels from other parts of the body. Some of the ones that you guys will learn about in your reading for chapter 13 involve the greater saphenous vein or the cephalic vein that can be found in the the leg and the arm respectively, in order to navigate around the blockage site. Okay, so I mentioned the anterior interventricular artery, or what we call the left anterior descending artery, because that artery specifically is one of the leading causes of deaths due to heart attack. It generates a heart attack, something called the widowmaker, that ends up completely obstructing blood flow to the left ventricle. And if we obstruct blood flow to the left ventricle, and the left ventricle infarcts, then it's unable to supply blood to the rest of the body, and then all of the rest of the tissues in our body senesce. Usually what ends up following is brain damage and brain death very, very quickly in a widowmaker heart attack. What we'll talk about on Thursday is a way that you can recognize whether or not a widowmaker heart attack is happening or is likely to happen by looking at an EKG strip. If you guys want to Google EKG tombstoning effect, you can look that up in your own time, but that's going to be one of the ways that we'll figure out on the EKG strip how we're able to assess what's going on with the heart and if a patient is at risk for a heart attack. Okay. All right. So that's it for today for lecture. Does anybody have any questions before we dive into lab very quickly, and then I give you guys the activity, or are we all just ready to go? Just get it on. All right, cool. Let's stop this.